Hello music lovers, thanks for stopping by the channel, thanks for watching this video. In this one, it's a classic brawl, the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. Who's it gonna be? Two of the biggest bands of all time. Now, why the heck are we even putting these two bands head to head? How did that happen? You know, you can blame it on Paul McCartney. He recently was on the Howard Stern show and Howard asked him, who's better, Beatles or Stones? And this is what Paul McCartney had to say. He said the Stones, are rooted in the blues. When they are writing stuff, it has to do with the blues. We had a little more influences. There's a lot of differences, and I love the Stones, but I'm with you. The Beatles were better. And that's certainly right. The Beatles did have a lot more influences than the Rolling Stones. I mean, all you got to do is ask Lucy, you know, the one in the sky with diamonds. So then Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones was asked about what Paul McCartney had said. He didn't know anything about it, but this is what he had to say. He said, that's so funny. He's a sweetheart. There's obviously no competition. We started doing stadium gigs in the 70s and are still doing them now. That's the real big difference between these two bands. One band is unbelievably lucky still playing in stadiums, and then the other band doesn't exist. Yeah, well, you know, Mick is right. There is no competition between these two bands. Well, I guess it depends on what we're talking about here, right? I'm going to run through a few categories and we'll see which band wins out, the Beatles or the Stones. For instance, when it comes to longevity, the Rolling Stones have it. I mean, let's face it, the Beatles by 1970, they were done. The Rolling Stones have been going for the past 50 years, and sometimes we don't even know how that's possible. You know, with Keith Richards, it's like the running joke. This is a guy who, he survived snorting his own father. And now, of course, we have some reason to believe that Keith Richards always was and always will be. Plus, the Rolling Stones have a brand new song. The Beatles haven't had anything new in quite some time, and I'm not talking about that Free as a Turd that they did with Jeff Lynne about 20 years ago. That was nothing. I'm talking about a bona fide band here. The Rolling Stones have a new song called Living in a Ghost Town. Have you heard it? It was a song that they wrote about a year ago. It's supposed to be on the next Stones album. They haven't put out a new album of brand new material probably in about 15 years, but this song kind of started to make sense with what's going on now, you know what I mean? So they reworded some of the lyrics and they put out this brand new video. And as a matter of fact, I have an exclusive cut of this new video. Would you like to see it? I'll share it here with you. Basically, going through towns, going through places, turning corners and seeing nobody. Oh, except for one. Look at this. Oh yeah, there's some action going on here, but otherwise, it is a total ghost town. When it comes to musicianship, the Rolling Stones easily win, hands down. I mean, they had much better guitar players, for example, especially a guy like Mick Taylor, who was out of the band by the early 70s. He's probably a better guitar player than all of them put together. But between him and Keith Richards and even Ron Wood, much better than George Harrison and John Lennon. When it comes to the drums, you know, as much as Ringo Starr has his own unique style that perfectly fit the Beatles and you couldn't take him out, I still got to give it to Charlie Watts. I think that he's a much better drummer, has a lot more in his toolbox, if you know what I'm saying. And when it comes to bass, though, I will give this to Paul McCartney. Not to say that Bill Wyman wasn't good or even Darryl Jones, who they've been playing with for the last few decades. They're really, really great, but Paul McCartney, very inventive on the bass guitar. Go listen to some of those Beatles tracks with the headphones. You can really hear Paul. Got to give it to him. Now, in terms of frontmen, I don't think there's any dispute. Mick Jagger is the king of the rock frontmen. No question about it. This guy, he is still running around like a chicken. And he sounds good too. This guy is 76 years old. Of course, Paul McCartney, he's still out there drawing big crowds, putting on great shows. Vocally, a lot weaker though than he used to be, whereas Mick Jagger still sounds as strong as ever. Gotta give the front man to Mick Jagger. Now, when it comes to performing live, I got to give this to the Rolling Stones, too. I mean, look, the Beatles quit performing in 1966. All the screaming girls, all the screaming fans, they couldn't even hear themselves play. So they decided to stop doing it live. And aside from the rooftop concert before they called it quits, the Beatles were pretty much not on the road a whole lot. However, what the Beatles did do live was major groundbreaking stuff. I mean, look, they played Shea Stadium, sold it out. No other band was doing that. They set the table for the Stones, who were doing that in the 70s. And plus the Ed Sullivan Show. This was probably the most influential performance in rock history. And we'll be getting to more of the influential impact a little bit later on. But the Rolling Stones, here they are 50 years later, and they're still performing live and selling out places, stadiums, you call it, whatever you want, around the world, still doing it, still leaving their mark. Speaking of which, it's time for some Rolling Stones Black and Blue trivia. Okay, so what did Keith Richards do when an eager fan jumped on stage and ran towards Mick Jagger at the end of their Hampton '81 pay-per-view concert? Did he try to trip him? Did he notify security? Or did he smash him with his guitar? So yeah, the answer is C. Keith Richards saw this guy running after Mick Jagger. He didn't know what to make of it, so he decided to smash him with his guitar. And here's the kicker. It stayed in tune for the rest of the show. Yeah, it's only rock and roll, and I like it. All right, so when it comes to the studio, I got to give this to the Beatles. I mean, look, even though they were only around a few years compared to the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, look, they were coming around at a time when singles is what drove the industry, all right? But when the Beatles came around, they came out with albums that were great. There was no filler. Every track was great. They started putting out groundbreaking album after groundbreaking album. Sgt. Pepper's, the White Album, Abbey Road, all these great albums, and they never had a bad one in the bunch. Rolling Stones, on the other hand, they've been around for decades longer, and they do have a string of albums from the late 60s to the early 70s, maybe Let It Bleed through Exile on Main Street, where they could do no wrong, but and maybe, you know, Some Girls and Tattoo You later on, but a lot of spotty stuff in the Rolling Stones catalog, whereas I think the Beatles were a lot tighter, a lot stronger in their material, and maybe that's because they didn't tour, they didn't go on the roads, they had a lot more time in the studio to noodle around. Now, when it comes to innovation and creativity, I got to give this one to the Beatles too. I mean, look, they always wanted to make the next song better than the last one. You know, they had all these different recording techniques that they would use. Of course, they had George Martin, and they had Jeff Emmerich, the sound engineer, and he would talk about how if they were recording a simple piano on one song, they would have the mic above the piano, and on the next one, they would mic it below, just to get a different sound. They would run their instruments and their vocals through these limiters. They would even like intentionally warble the tape while it was on the reel just to get a different sound out of it. They were always pushing boundaries, and that's why every Beatles album is different. Whereas the Rolling Stones, sure, they went into some new areas, but for the most part, I think the Stones albums, they kind of sound like they're cut from the same mold. I think the Beatles definitely had the edge when it came to creativity. And last but not least, let's talk about influence. And I got to give this to the Beatles, hands down. I mean, look, I've talked to plenty of people who were around at the time that the Beatles came out, and the way that they described the scene and the way it changed, it was like things went from black and white to Technicolor. You know, the Beatles come on, and all of a sudden, you've got a band that you care about every single member. You know their names. They all sang, you know, 3-part harmonies, albums with no filler. You suddenly cared who was on bass, who was on drums, and all this stuff, and we didn't have that before. The Beatles are the blueprint for the modern pop band, the way that the Stones are the blueprint for the current rock band, that's for sure. And the Stones definitely had their influence, no question about it, but how many guys have you ever heard in the music business talk about how it was seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan that made them want to pick up an instrument, that made them want to get into the business? I think that the Ed Sullivan Show, as I said before, probably the single most influential moment in music history, and I got to give that to the Beatles. Simply put, the Rolling Stones were the band that maybe you used to piss off your parents, whereas the Beatles, their songs, you know, you could share that with your grandmother, you know what I mean? Kind of like on Gilligan's Island, you know, Ginger was the one that you dated, Mary Ann's the one that you took home to the folks, you know what I mean? All right, so the Beatles versus the Stones. Who do you choose? Let me know. Drop it below. I know for myself, I listen to the Rolling Stones actually more than the Beatles, probably because they've got so much more material to listen to, a lot more live music, a lot more studio albums. And the Rolling Stones, they have weathered so many trends, disco, early 80s, electronic music, grunge. The Rolling Stones, they weathered all of those storms with their own brand of rock and roll. And so I admire them greatly. However, I gotta edge out the Beatles in this fight because of their creativity and because of their influence that they've had over the music industry. I gotta edge out the Beatles. So that's who I pick as the winner for this video. Let me know what you think. Drop it down below in the comments. And the description below, I'm going to list my favorite songs by both of these bands. I've got a playlist too with some videos related to things I've talked about in this video, so be sure to check that out. And if you want to support this channel, all you got to do is engage. Click like. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. More fans will see it. Hit that subscribe button and engage by leaving your comments. Let me know who you pick, Beatles or Stones. Drop it below, and I will see you guys next time, all right? Take care.